purpose today was to kind of review where we are with some of the trade negotiations going on, put a special emphasis on what's happening within the wheat industry. And so the couple main messages. Number one, we have to stay diligent. We have to be paying attention. This is really an evolving story, and new information is coming out on a daily basis. And I know that makes it very frustrating for farmers to try and make some marketing decisions for not only the crop they have in the bin, but then also trying to figure out what to do for 2019 acreage. I guess the key points is right now we're focused primarily on China, on the Chinese trade agreements. Obviously having a huge impact on soybeans, but it also has potentially an impact on spring wheat because China does buy a surprising amount of spring wheat from the United States as well, and of course spring wheat being a dominant crop here in North Dakota. The other thing that I tried to focus on was some of the other trade agreements that we are not as verse on, we don't know as much about. So there's a new trade agreement we're trying to negotiate now with the U.S. and Japan, because again, the U.S. just backed out of TPP here recently. The TPP countries went around and they did, the countries in the TPP, the old TPP, without the U.S., did sign an agreement. The revised version of TPP, they did go in and make that deal, and of course that really actually has a pretty significant influence on potential wheat exports. Japan, Canada, and Australia are all part of this new TPP agreement. And under this new agreement, the import tariffs that Japan currently has on wheat products are slowly going to be reduced over time. And the fact that the United States is not part of that agreement means that U.S. wheat is going to be taxed at the old rates and Canadian and Australian wheat is going to be taxed at the lower rates. And so we in the U.S. really need to be focused on getting that agreement, one-on-one agreement with U.S. and Japan. We started negotiations now. The big question is how long will it take? So first was to explain kind of what are the key agreements that we need to be looking for the wheat industry. And then the second was to talk a little bit about the timing. And in particular, the March 1 deadline for the agreement between the United States and China. And then later on, we're going to have a prospective plantings report at the end of March that gave us a first indication of kind of nationally what the farmers think they're going to plant in 2019. So the month of March is going to be very, very important for kind of strategy and how we move forward in time. Historically, what's happened is because the U.S. has been a very dominant soybean exporter, the U.S. companies or U.S. soybeans were one of the first calls people made. If you're looking for soybeans in the world market, you called the U.S. and you called Brazil, you might give a call to Argentina to see what they have available. Well, now with some of these trade disputes and some of the disagreements we're having in the international market, one of my big concerns is that we're not going to be that first call anymore. That, yeah, we'll probably get a call to see if we have some soybeans available, but we're not going to be that first call. We're not going to be getting kind of on the ground floor. If they can find the soybeans someplace else, if they find them cheaper someplace else, they will likely go there. And so that has some spillover effects also then into wheat, because if our soybean exports start to drop, soybean prices start to fall, people start shifting acres and they start looking at growing other crops. And of course, wheat is one of those crops that has enough acreage base to absorb a pretty significant amount of the acres. We can't really afford to make too many mistakes. You know, we're always kind of guessing, we're always looking into the future, trying to anticipate what's going to happen. Inevitably, you're going to make some mistakes. You just hope that they're not big ones. And the way you avoid a big mistake is to try and pay attention, try and understand what the implications are, to put a plan together, to actually have a strategy rather than just kind of winging it or shooting from the hip. That really isn't a plan. And unfortunately, in the last few years, a lot of farmers have had this kind of wait and see attitude when it comes to marketing. And that for some of them, that's really caused some problems. It's caused some heartburn. So what I'm really encouraging, the reason that these kinds of programs are really important is, again, to try and gather as much information as you can, understand what's going on, and to try and put a plan together that is actually thought through and saying, well, yeah, we may have to shift, it may have to change over time, but at least have a strategy in place rather than just guessing or winging it as we move through time. So having that plan is really important because it forces you to think about what's going on.
How does the intellectual property thing tie into ag?
Okay, so when we're looking at the trade negotiations between the U.S. and China, there's kind of a list of kind of the top 5 or 6 issues that really need to be hammered out in any kind of an agreement between China and the U.S. And one of those obviously is agriculture and agricultural products, but the real big ticket issues, the ones that have the biggest impact not only U.S. but also Chinese economy, is intellectual property rights, direct foreign investment, what U.S. companies need to do to be able to sell their products into the Chinese markets, and concerns about if we share technology, that technology suddenly gets stolen or used against us in the future. And so those are really the big ticket items. So with the challenge we have in agriculture is, yeah, we're important, we're part of the negotiations, we've been pulled into the center of this disagreement, but most of the trade disputes are not really revolving around agricultural products. And so the question I raised to the group was, well, where does ag fit within this? How important is getting the best deal possible for agriculture? And it's obviously, we're in the mix, agriculture is part of that discussion, but I assure you it's not the top issue. It's not the thing that they're spending the most time negotiating and trying to hammer out. It's this trade issues with intellectual property, and how does if you're a company in the U.S., how do you do business in China with some security and some concern, and not worry about your technology being stolen or somehow misused? So ag's important, but it certainly is not at the top of the list.